Let me introduce our speaker. Then this is Associate Professor Dr. Jonathan Day. He will present the paper titled Genius Loci.
Romp naked through the woods, and we filmed her at night, and then actually nobody ever notices that she's there, which is really interesting. So that's that piece. We solarized it to get it white instead of black, but it's about place, and that's what started me thinking. The last album that I did looked at that. So this term, I love this way that we discover things, and we don't know what they are or why we discover them until later. You get this exegesis effect where something happens for you and it's real and it's amazing, and then later you kind of start to understand it. So some years ago, I came up with this idea of the dim-lit subterranea of the ancient mind. You know, the underground, the thing that's in our head and that's there. So I'm using that as a title today. And people I'm looking at for this are Carl Jung, Konrad Lorenz, Hermann Hesse, Mary Webb, John Corbett, Corinne Gabbard. Those last two names will be known to people who are fans of jazz and the pedagogy of jazz, the studies of jazz, and the Japanese poet Obaku. Some examples drawn from my work. I want this to be academic, of course, because we're in a university. Theoretical, has to be, but also personal. For me, if it doesn't inform the music, I have no interest in it, because my emphasis is music. And it needs to inform what I'm doing musically for it to have a real purpose for me. That doesn't mean that's true for everyone, of course, but for me it's true. So my last album was called Atlantic Drifter, and this was recorded while touring and playing concerts. It was recorded in lots of different places as an experiment in response to place. How would I make the music in one place as opposed to another place? What kind of difference would recording on one of the Georgia Sea Islands make to recording in Belarus or recording in Helsinki? I was really interested to know whether that emerges, whether anything of the place that you do something in emerges, because place had always been intuitively important to me as a musician and a songwriter. That's the front of the album. It's a drawing I made of a Hebridean island called Rum, a fantastic place if anyone ever gets the chance to go. This is another nearby island, so that's the project. The album was well received critically, of course, as always, disastrous commercially, with some unintentionally intriguing comments from critics. And this was one, a critic called Helen G, writing for a magazine called Folk Radio. She said, Jonathan's guitar is blazing like the sun through morning mist. It's the kind of invective we expect from critics. You know, they either absolutely love you or they absolutely hate you. So this was kind of fun for me. And what was significant is that song was exactly about the sun through morning mist. And she had no way to know that. It's not in the lyric. It was when the song was made. It's not what the song says. It's not me trying to do Grieg again and describe sunrise. She just got it. And I thought that was so interesting. She was exactly right. So I wonder how that works. So number one, composition or spontaneous composition, which is another word for improvisation, is deep. So what do I mean? The origins and genesis of compositional practice are shrouded in mystery. Some of it as an affectation and some as a reality, I believe. Jonathan Harvey, hopefully lots of you are familiar with his work, writes, I take no enjoy in composing if I set out in broad daylight knowing exactly what I want. Each work must grope out into some dark region in which the imagination and unconscious can operate together. I'm conflating in improvisation and composition somewhat, taking the line that improvisation is akin to instantaneous composition. So in composition, instantaneous or otherwise, we're looking for something. Maybe that thing is a thing or a state or an experience which is other than the everyday or the non-compositional state. So some sort of state of being, state of mind when we're making something or place that is in a way beyond. So Jonathan Harvey continues, each work gropes into a dark region, full of contradiction, uncertainty, mystery, doubt, without irritable reaching after fact. That's what John Keats said. It must live in ambiguity. Debussy said music must come from the shadows. Mahler, the creation and genesis of a work is mystical from beginning to end, since one himself unconscious must create something as though through outside inspiration. Afterwards, one scarcely understands how it happened. Now, that's fabulous, I think. It sees the composer as a conduit for some great force descending or ascending from the sky or the earth, and it runs through you. No wonder songwriting, composing, improvising is so fantastic to be involved in, if that has any truth to it at all. So John Corbett, writing in Jazz Amongst the Discourses, a fabulous book, says the all-consuming desire on the part of the performer for the unknown, uncharted, area beyond territory. The nomadic impulse is certain but problematic. So he's kind of saying that people want to go to a strange place, to find something beyond, something other. So I want to refer to the writings of Hermann Hesse and also a writer called Mary Webb, because they are from the same time as Carl Jung, who is at the centre of this. And I just thought it would be fun to do that. No real other reason. They're from the same time, and I thought it would be fun. So Hermann Hesse writes this in his book Steppenwolf. I recommend it for you. From a dance hall there met me as I passed by the strains of jazz music, hot and raw as the steam of flesh. Jazz was repugnant to me, so he hates it, but 10 times preferable to the academic music of the day. For me too, its raw and savage gaiety reached an underworld of instinct. So what is that underworld of instinct? Composing and improvising seems to exist within, emerge from, to even seek an alternative state to our everyday state. So that's number 1, concluded. Number 2, what kind of state is it, that state that we're looking for? There were lots of mentions in those quotations of the unconscious and of instinct, so something sub-rational. Hermann Hesse talks of music as the sacred sense of beyond, of timelessness, of a world which had an eternal value. He says our only guide is our homesickness. So, in playing or deep listening, you know when you're listening to something and it just consumes you. I'm guessing as musicians we're all used to that. We all know what that is, when it sort of, you're just somewhere special. In deep listening, we experience something. I want to argue that that is an escape from or a stilling of the apparatus of our frothy and functional constructed selves, and an escape to a deeper place. Emmylou Harris, to be populist for a moment, writes it as water from a deeper well. So what do I mean by constructed selves? The philosopher Schopenhauer argues 2 things that are important for us here. Personalities, the thing that we project, according to him, is a construct. We create ourselves, and we create it to survive the trauma of existence. So we make a personality that we sell to everyone else in order that we can survive social interaction and survive the experience of our life. In music, says Schopenhauer, we can escape from that, escape ourselves into another place. His theme is taken up by many other writers, the feminist philosopher Judith Butler, the artistic feminist philosopher Peggy Phelan, take up that theme. In playing and in deep listening, some performers and listeners have written about disconnection from their everyday normality. In the experience of the beautiful, or in jazz you might call it the cool, in the improvisational moment and in deep listening, we escape, I suggest with great relief, and albeit temporarily, the intense consuming effort of the perpetration of the created self. So in those moments, we don't have to worry about who we think we should be anymore for a brief time. We experience then, in that place, a connection to the nameless fecund immensity, which is our context. If we forget about being separate for a moment, we can enjoy the ways in which we belong, maybe. So Hermann Hesse again, I was myself no longer. My personality was dissolved in the intoxication of the festivity like salt in water. It's a great description of improvising and deep listening, becoming part. When we come back to ourselves after these experiences, the experience can leave us refreshed and renewed. Do you feel that? When you listen to music and you love it, afterwards you feel better. Yeah? Maybe? Okay, no response was the response. It can leave us refreshed and renewed. It does me. Jacques Lacan, psychoanalytical philosopher, French, he has a notion that's called tearing the veil. And I think that's relevant here. Hesse describes it this way. It demonstrates to anyone whose soul has fallen to pieces that she can rearrange these pieces of a previous self in any order he pleases and attain to an endless multiplicity of moves in the game of life. From the pieces of the disintegrated self, we build up ever new groups with ever new interplay and suspense and new situations that are eternally inexhaustible. So Lacan's concept of the veil, breaking the veil, is that we have a destruction of personality, and that can actually be very beneficial and positive in that we can rewrite ourselves like version 2 of me, which is better than version 1. And I think music can play. If we accept this desire for depth within composition, what can we understand about that state of depth? So number 3, the nature of depth. Carl Jung says this: the essential thing psychologically is that in dreams, fantasies, and other exceptional states of mind, and I'm adding here, such as when we are improvising or composing, the most far-fetched mythological motifs and symbols can appear orthogonously at any time, often apparently as the result of particular influences, traditions and excitations working on the individual, but more often without any sign of them. So do you get that? What he's saying is that mythical things can appear to us when we're in a state of composition, meditation, dream, that things that are mythical can appear to us of their own volition because of the influences of things. But we may not see what the influence that's bringing them there is. So these primordial images or archetypes, as I have called them, says Jung, belong to the basic stock of the unconscious psyche and can't be explained as personal acquisitions. Together they make up the psychic stratum, which we have called the collective unconscious. Now then, Jung argues that collective unconscious and race memory leak traces in our deep cognition that in exceptional states of mind we can access. So that's one of my principal points, that when we're in a state of otherness, like composing or improvising, performing, things can leak from the deep parts of ourselves that we might see as inspiration. So things actually are coming, not from somewhere else that's outside ourselves, but from something in ourselves that we don't always access. So it gives that sense of something coming from somewhere, and it is something coming from somewhere. The problem, of course, is people want to think of Jung as psychobabble. So let's try and overcome that just for 10 minutes, if you'll be with me on that. So Jung goes on to say, individual consciousness in the highest degree is influenced by inherited presuppositions, apart from the unavoidable influences exerted upon it by the environment. The collective unconscious compromises in itself the psychic life of our ancestors, right back to the earliest beginnings. The matrix of conscious occurrences, and it exerts an influence that compromises the freedom of consciousness in the highest degree, since it is continually striving to lead conscious processes back into the old paths. So try not to see it as hokum and dubious psychobabble, but the germ of a scientific proof that part of our thinking comes from our history, not just through cultural influences, but through genetic transmission. It's not very fashionable. It certainly doesn't sit happily with lots of late 20th century French philosophy. We're not going to talk about that, but we could, why that exists. So in that we see the germ of Konrad Lorenz's proof that much of what we see and experience comes to us as inheritance through our DNA, demonstrated by lots of writers. I'm referring here to Stevens. So Konrad Lorenz worked with wolves and ducks. He's a behavioral scientist with animals. And he demonstrated that behavior is frequently inherited. So the way he did that is he took baby ducks and baby wolves away from all of the other ducks and wolves. You can say it's cruel, and I'll agree with you. When they grew up, they still acted like adult ducks. They knew how to do mating dance, very specific in the case of some of the ducks, a very specific way of behaving. They had never seen it happen from birth. So he demonstrates that behavior is inherited. Now, if we extend that, and if you'll come with me on that journey, that aspects of how we behave are also inherited through our genetic history. So we can argue that much of our musical inclination and practice emerges from inherited and biochemical aspects of ourselves. I've argued that in a previous book of mine, Politics of Globalization. As a basic proof of that, we can talk about the octave. The octave only exists for human beings because we have a spiral cochlea. There is no octave in nature. Well, there is, because it's in our cochlea, but outside of our perception, the octave is not super important and imposed upon the universe. We hear it because of the way our ear is constructed. So that's a biochemical aspect of ourselves. Okay, how are we doing? Still with me? Yeah? Half? So let me give you a more populist version of the same thing that I'm talking about from a lovely English writer called Mary Webb. She wrote books in the place where I live. And this is a book about a girl who is 16, 17. She lives in the woods. She has no mum. Her dad doesn't care about her. And she's an astonishing singer, but she's never been trained. So she's at a church event singing, and people are like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. Her voice is amazing. But the writer is thinking, how did that happen? Poor child, a man thought. Is it a mystical longing or a sense of sin that cries in her voice? It's neither of these things. It's nothing that Edward could have understood at the time, though later he did. It was the grief of rainy forests and the moan of stormy water, the muffled complaint of driven leaves, the keening of life for the perishing matter it inhabits. She expressed things she knew nothing of, like a blackbird does. For though she was young and fresh, she had her origin in the old dark heart of earth, full of innumerable agony. And in that heart she dwelt, and ever would, singing from its gloom as a bird sings in a tree. Her being was full of echoes, that the hearts of those that live further from the soil, and we are all as full of echoes as a rocky wood, echoes of the past, reflex echoes of the future, echoes of the soil, these last reverberating in our filmiest dreams, like the sound of thunder in an orchard. The echoes are in us of great voices long gone hence, the unknown cries of beasts on the mountain, the sullen aims of creatures in the slime, the love call of the bittern. We know too echoes of things outside our ken, which means knowledge. The thought that shapes itself in the bee's brain and becomes a waxen box of sweets, the tyranny of youth stirring in the womb, the crazy terror of small slaughtered beasts, the upward push of folded grass, and how the leaf feels in all its veins, the cold rain, the ceremonial that passes yearly in the emerald temple of bud and calyx. We've walked those temples, we are the sacrifice on those altars. It goes on, and I could read it because it's beautiful, but I'll go on from there. So he's really talking about the way that our minds and ourselves are linked to things past. Finally, 4. This is genius loci, the agency of place. How does place affect us? So in the light of the ideas I've presented so far, it's a clear possibility that if we are playing in a particular place and time, it will result in very particular influences bearing on the player, the so-called genius loci, or the spirit of place. So I can tell you last night, for me, that happened. Being here, 2 hours sleep in, I think, 38 hours, standing on a stage with people I'd never met, in a room that was unexpectedly beautiful, with projections, with a great sound system, a very interesting audience, listening to that great band before me. That all made the performance. There's an old pop and jazz musician's comment that a performance is always about the audience. So that's also something to do with this notion of spirit of place. The Zen tradition, and you can see we're on the last writer I mentioned, that will make you feel happy, I think. The Zen tradition argues it elegantly, saying that looking outside ourselves is essential when we're seeking to explore the sub-self, to go deeper than personality. Obaku, 9th century writer, who I love and has been incredibly important for me, says that the foolish eschew phenomena and embrace thought. The wise eschew thought and embrace phenomena. So phenomena is those things outside ourselves, thought is that inside. He says the wise person looks outside for wisdom, not inside. So, very briefly, because we don't have so much time, this is a guy who lives in the frozen lands in the north. He makes his instruments from ice. Percussion, trumpets, some violins, even you can make from ice. Very interesting because they constantly shrink in size. Right now, they're made from ice. This is an ice trumpet and an ice marimba. And it's also in a cave cut from ice. And it was recorded in a recording studio cut into ice. And then it was in a glacier, and slowly the recording studio fell from the glacier into the ocean. When, obviously they'd left by then. They weren't still inside doing the 27th take. Okay, so we need to move on. This is me. The heavy waves. So this, I went to a cave that's very famous from Mendelssohn, Fingal's Cave. It's volcanic, beautiful. All of the walls are cut with lines from the way that it was formed. The reverb is astonishing. And I just sang a piece about the whales that lived there and the way they were hunted, but they survived. This you can see on SoundCloud or YouTube, and this will be a piece for the new record. I won't let it go for too long because we're running low on time. Another piece. Let's not watch that at all. So to finish, the language of the unconsciousness. What I've been saying is all fine, but if I'm trying to say that these things are communicated, we need to have some way of understanding that there is a language happening. So it's all well and good for the individual in the landscape, but can any of that actually be communicated? And if it can, does that even matter? How do we account for that communicative aspects of composition and improvisation? Why do we listen to John Coltrane still? He was about being there and then. He's dead now. It's ages ago, but we still listen to it, and people learn the solos, which I always find fascinating. What is it that communicates? I think it's fair to say that communication isn't always intended by musicians. There was a long period of my career when I did not care if anyone heard what I did. It made me nervous if they listened to what I did. It wasn't about communicating, it was something else. So it's not always intended or desired, but it's very often achieved, even if you don't want it to be. Why is that? Well, back to Lacan. He argues for a structure in the unconscious that is linguistic in nature. So the deep levels of our cognition is structured in a paralinguistic manner. So if that's the case, if it's like language, then clearly the things coming from that deep cognition can be communicated. We can think of it as music as a meta-language that may not be as precise as words, but I would argue is far more significant and powerful, that we communicate between ourselves in that way. If we accept we have a model for that, for this kind of communication we're discussing, it allows us to do that. So Lacan went beyond the proposition that the unconsciousness is a structure, and argues that it's structured like a language. He says that it's organized in an intricate network governed by association, and above all metaphoric associations. And the existence of that network is shown by analysis of its unconscious products, dreams, symptoms, and so on. So at a simple level, people often dream of similar kinds of scenarios and things, which suggests a common language. So then, when we're in an exceptional state, like deep listening to music or improvising, according to Lacan, the structuring of the unconscious imparts a metalinguistic quality to improvisation. So we understand what people are saying through their instrument. When we're in that exceptional state, that's the same thing I just said, the striving that we feel, the need for renewal and transgression, The imperative is also a desire to communicate, to speak with, and this is a biblical reference, just to be controversial, in size deeper than words. So people talk about prayer as being a communication in size deeper than words. John Corbett says improvisation doesn't mean the death of language. In the place of the dead language, disfigured and defiled codes, a new one emerges more vibrant than the last. Improvisation always involves the permanent play of threshold and transgression. So place, where we are, can be a powerful partner in accessing our deep and ancient selves, and offers a powerful language or dialect with which to speak. Leonard Bernstein sought a universal music language, and Yo-Yo Ma talks about that as well in his Silk Road project. Music is something we heard first in the womb, before we were born, as the fascinating gurgling of our mothers and the strange intimations of a world that was to come. We heard it as we ourselves came into being. Victor Zuckerkandl wrote, Wittgenstein was wrong to say when words run out, there is only silence. When words run out, we can sing. That's the end. Thank you for listening very much.
There'll be a lot of questions.
Or none. Either is fine.
If not, I have to talk to you later about communication.
No problem. So no questions?
As you say, eventually a lot of questions. What I have is, at a deep level of intrigue, why you bring this here today, and the genius of place, the here and now. What brings
To myth and realities, music, myth and realities.
St. Bob to this point in time? I'm just really curious.
Do you mean, why do I bring it to this conference?
Yes,
Or?
yes, well, yes.
Yeah, because I think that if we take on Joseph Campbell's point, he says that myth is the mask of God. Myths are the masks of God. I think that what is happening in the writing of Hess, who in a lot of ways actually makes Jung, similar ideas to Jung, much more comprehensible, is an attempt to discover what is the source of the mythic. So if we accept, even if just for a moment, that all of myth and religion is humanly generated. So what the process seems to be that we generate a mythos, we generate a whole scheme of beliefs and characters, and then inhabit it. So that we create it and then we move in. So like building a house and we move in. So we move into the religious system of Christianity or of Buddhism. We've made these things and then we live within it, and as Dawkins argues, we die for these things. He calls them memes. We're prepared to die for a religion or the sense of a nation or the elevation of a no different at all individual to a position of king or ruler or duke or emperor or pope. So I'm really interested in the processes of that. And I think that what Jung and Hess are really talking about is how those myths are created. What's the aspect of our cognition that makes them powerful, that gives myths power? And then from that, I think we can extend into how does that relate to composers and to performers. And the way I think that relates to composers and performers is that they are accessing that same deep intellectual, emotional, foundational history of the human animal in those moments of composition, improvisation. So actually the whole sort of mythic realm and the whole religious realm are analogous to the sorts of things that are happening for composers and improvisers, which is why actually composers and improvisers then become part of mythology. So if we try to think about you know, there was an absolutely brilliant comment recently. I think it's in the documentary about Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road project, which I would recommend to everyone. It's a really great film. And there's a fantastic comment there that nobody remembers who the king was when Beethoven wrote his music. Does anyone know? Because I don't. And the point of the guy who is a guy who's come from a very bad political situation with lots of war and, you know, that guy's had a lot of bad experiences. He's making the point that the music survives, the art survives. No one remembers who that ruler who was fighting and, you know, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people died in those battles. No one even knows their names. Everyone or lots of people remember what the music was. And I think that's really significant, you know. So there's another great comment, you know, from that. Sorry, yeah.
I'm doing a presentation tomorrow. I'm actually going to make exactly that point.
Yeah.
And I think that's extraordinary, that I'm bringing exactly that point of the battles that's during Mozart rather than Beethoven. But that idea of echoes in time, if you like,
Yeah.
is fascinating.
Yeah.
And also that I've been pushing the Silk Road film
Ah.
for precisely the same reasons. It's
Yeah.
extremely interesting that point where it hits the wall, it goes back to your point, it hits the wall at a certain point and resonates back in space. It's incredibly interesting.
Well, I mean, you know, maybe I should finish with this, but I was asked the question for they're doing these little interviews in the, I don't know if you've been dragged in yet to the White Room. You know, I was like, can you come with me? I'm staff. I was like, okay, you know, and it only takes 10 minutes. And then they were asking, you know, what is the point of this? And what can they do next year? I mean, the point, I think, is that even if it's a tiniest of seeds, the way that we promote the potential future of our species, because we cannot take it for granted that the human species has a future. If we don't sort out a lot of the mess that we're in, we don't have one. So the way that we promote the future of our species is through the kind of positive action that's represented in a gathering like this. You know, because the music is powerful, and the music will help to make for that better world. And whether it's likely or not that we'll succeed, I think just the endeavour is essential and admirable. And ultimately that is the reason for making a presentation like this or performing yesterday, the people who performed tonight, you know. I think we're all contributing to that. And the great thing about that point that you're going to make about Mozart is that actually history supports it. History supports that the music is more important than the crazy, mad, power-hungry politicians and warmongers, you know, and that has to be a message of hope, doesn't it? I think so. No, thank you for listening. Thanks very much.